Hey everybody, welcome back. I hope you had a great spring break and another week of coronavirus break, and we are back. Heard a lot of people kvetching about the idea that we were now going to be going online for our classes and how inconvenient that was. And for me, I thought, well, we're online all the time, so really nothing changes for us in the wonderful, fun-filled land of world religions. I am excited about today because we're going to begin with Judaism today, which takes us into a whole nother group of religions, particularly groups we call monotheism. Polytheism, as you understand it, has been religions based on multiple gods. Today we're beginning what is known as monotheistic faiths. The majority of us in this class are mostly experienced, I assume, in monotheistic faiths. Judaism, Christianity, Islam, those are monotheistic faiths. They believe in one God, not multiple gods. Now, I want to have a conversation with you that our book does not have because I think it's really important. So I want to take, again, your book level, and I want to sort of break that down and make it, give you another perspective to look at that and to bring it at a more base level, but also more in-depth level for you to look at and do a little processing in our dialogue this week online in our forums. Judaism is the world's first real monotheistic religion. It begins in the story of Exodus in the scriptures the story in Genesis in the scriptures where it talks about the call of God to Abram, A-B-R-A-M, Abram. The story says that God spoke to Abram, told Abram that he had been chosen and that from Abram there would be born a chosen people. There was a new covenant. Okay, the covenant, the berit in Hebrew. Berit is that idea of covenant, chosenness. And so this idea of chosenness, covenant with Abraham, and the signs of the covenant with Abraham would be three. They would be an actual covenant, a land, and a people, descendants as numerous as the stars. If you're familiar with the story, you may know that Abram and his wife Sarai had no children. They did finally have a child. A brief story. Abram and Sarai were promised children by God, descendants as numerous as the stars. Sarai was barren and she was old. She was not able to have children. So what she did was she told Abram that he was to go into his maid Hagar's tent. He was to have a child with his maid Hagar. And Jewish theology, Jewish practice in that day was very common, that if a servant had a child by her master, the woman who suckled the child first was the one, or held the child first, was the one who was the mother of the child. And so therefore, Hagar gave birth, Sarah held the baby first, and she became the mother of the child. And the child's name was Ishmael. Ishmael became the firstborn child of Abraham. He became the child of the covenant. Well, at one point then later on, Sarah does miraculously get pregnant by Abraham, and she has a child. That child is named Isaac. Isaac is her natural son, not her sort of pseudo-adopted son through Hagar. And she then throws Hagar and Ishmael out into the desert to die. Hagar sits under a tree, puts her baby under her at that point young child under another tree, and says to God, please just let me die. Do not let me look on the death of my child. We're in the desert. It's dangerous. We have no water. There's no way to provide for us out here. And we're both going to die. So please, Lord, just let me die and not watch my son die. An angel appears to Hagar and says, your son will also be the father of a nation. And there becomes, for them, a miracle. Water appears in the desert, and they survive. And Ishmael does indeed become the father of a great nation, and that great nation is known as Islam. So what you end up having is, and this is very important, we'll get to it in a few minutes, you end up having Abraham, the patriarch, having two sons, Isaac and Ishmael. Here's the problem. One is his legitimate son. The other is his son with his handmaid. But his eldest natural-born son, just not his legitimate son with his wife. So both Isaac and Ishmael claim descendancy through Abraham to be the receptors of God's covenant through Abram, who later became known as Abraham. His name was changed. Sarai's name became changed as Sarah. So that's a little bit of the story that we'll get to in a few minutes. Now, covenant, land, and people. Those are the signs of the new relationship, right? Descendants as numerous as the stars, and land. That's really, really important. Signs of the covenant with God, to be God's chosen ones. Want to back up just a little bit for you. And this stuff comes from, now this part here comes actually from my doctoral dissertation, which, by the way, if you run out of toilet paper in the coronavirus crisis, my doctoral dissertation will suffice just beautifully. Not good for a whole hell of a lot else. There is a concept that I want to bring out to you that I explore in my doctoral dissertation. Before this time, there was something called the Agricultural Revolution. Before the Agricultural Revolution, people were hunters and gatherers. Everyone had what they needed. Everyone cared for themselves. Men hunted, women gathered, men fished, women took care of the home, and every family was cared for by themselves, all right? There was no external forces at play here. And then at one point in ancient history, we have what was called the Agricultural Revolution. In the Agricultural Revolution, there became such a thing as commodity. Food became commodity. What that means is food became something that was had or wanted, sold or bought. For the very first time in human history, necessities became commodity. So it played out like this. I have flour, you have sugar. Someone else has meat, someone else has dairy. And so we then trade back and forth and barter and sell and buy to have what we need to take care of our families. There's no more such thing as everyone is completely sustaining of their own families. Food now becomes commodity. This is important because it now changes humanity in a way that we've never been before. It was from this development that we see religion coming from polytheism, or in the case of Buddhism, atheism, to monotheism, okay? Monotheistic religions. Monotheism is built on one concept. That concept is berit, B-E-R-I-T-H in Hebrew. Berit is the concept of covenant. Monotheism is built on the covenant between God and God's people. There is one God. I am God's chosen. This idea of chosenness now develops. So what happens is, for the very first time in human history, religion becomes a commodity. Okay? Faith becomes something that is commodity. I have a chosenness with God, therefore you do not. Someone is in, someone is out. Someone is chosen, someone is not. For the very first time, faith becomes something that is representative of a special chosenness. Someone has it, which implies philosophically that if I'm saved, you're not. Being saved is only important if there are unsaved. If everyone is saved, we call that universalism. If everyone is saved, it makes no sense for me to take pride in being saved because, frankly, we're all saved. Who cares? Now, this is important, okay? Because when faith becomes commodity, we now begin to look at the world differently. Who writes the rules? The people who are in. Who's out is defined by who's in. Isn't that true? So those who are saved define what it means to be saved. Those who are chosen, in Israel terms, define what it means for those to be chosen. Who's in defines who's out. We see this playing in Judaism, we see it playing in Islam, and we see it also playing in Christianity, don't we? So who writes the rules? That depends on who's in power. Who's out It depends distinctly on who's in. So when men write the rules, women are not as included. When rich people write the rules, poor people are not as included. When straight people write the rules, gay people aren't as included. And so it continues, even to this day. We end up seeing when faith becomes commodity, it becomes about setting up regulations to determine, and I would also say to safeguard. We're going to defend our land now. We're going to safeguard and defend what it means to be chosen. Because again, you can't be chosen if I'm chosen. I can't be special if you're special too. Let me put this in a familial context for you. If mom and dad have a special child, we can't all be that special child. Because if mom and dad love you and you're their favorite, I can't be their favorite too. And that's what we're playing at. That's extremely overly simplified, but it does get the idea across. Especially when we talk about Israel and Palestine, Jews and Muslims here in just a few minutes. Okay? For the Middle East, land has become covenant. One of the things you'll see throughout the Old Testament, and this plays into what we call the Judeo-Christian perspective. Let me back up just a second. We can't talk about Christianity without talking about Judaism. We can't talk about Islam without talking about Judaism, because Judaism began it all. From Judaism came Islam. From Judaism came Christianity. And so, particularly as a Christian person, my faith is referred to as the Judeo-Christian faith. Jesus was a Jew. I cannot be Christian if I don't also realize that my roots are steeped in Judaism. So here comes a bit of a problem. Okay, let's talk theology for just a few minutes. I'm going to get preachy on you, and I apologize for that, but it plays importantly into where we are today. Part of Israel's theology, not Judaism today, Judaism back then, I want to be very clear. So Jews today are not as much like this as Jews were 2,000, 4,000 years ago, okay, 6,000 years ago. Being God's chosen also means that there is a relationship with the divine that is based on covenant. Covenant is not contract. Contracts are entered into and negotiated. Covenants are not. There is one who gives the covenant, we receive the covenant. We do not negotiate like buying your car, negotiating. No. This is a covenant. God is here, we are here. We are not equals. Clear. What this sets up, however, ancient Judaism had this idea from their experience, quite frankly, and it was legitimate, that sin was a cancer. And sin would offend God. And when God was offended, people suffered. Whenever you read the Old Testament, what you see over and over and over again is this theology that says, when God gets pissed, we suffer. So don't piss off God. Every time they talk about going to Egypt as slaves in the exile, it's because God was angry. The people suffered. This happens over and over again. Assyria comes in and takes over Israel. Babylonia comes in and takes over Israel. Rome comes in and takes over Israel. And, excuse me, not coronavirus. Every time we talk about that stuff, it's because God was angry, people suffered. We see it in the book of Job over and over and over again. If you know the book of Job, Job is a metaphor, not a historical person. But in the story of Job, we see in the Old Testament the story of a man who everything he had was taken away. His crops, his cattle, his herds, his family, and everyone around him said, Job, what did you do to piss off God? How did you get God angry? Repent and make it better now. Job cried and cried. I did not do anything to offend God. And in the end, of course, the end of the story, we realize that's the moral of the story is Job did not offend God. It's just that things happen and Job was the sufferer of those things. His faith was still strong. All of that is to illustrate something that we see. Israel was afraid of angering God. They had to toe the line. So what you end up seeing in Jewish history is the rising up of a class of people called Pharisees and Sadducees, who were not bad people. they get a bad rap. They were good people. They loved God and they were serious about their faith. But their job was to keep everyone in line, because if you screwed up, we all suffered. And so my job as a Pharisee or a Sadducee was to keep you in line. Everyone had to observe all the Sabbath laws. Everyone had to take care of all of the right protocols for purity and for righteousness, offer the right sacrifices, do the right things, behave in the right ways. Because if we messed up, if we forgot the law, then we offended God as people of the covenant. And if God got offended, we would all go back to exile. That could not happen again. So you end up in some ways with a really, really interesting theology that ends up becoming based on chosenness, but also in some ways based in fear, in my opinion, because you end up with this theology that sort of cowers before God. This plays itself into Christianity and Islam in very, very important ways. The great Puritan preacher Jonathan Edwards had a very famous sermon in the 1600s up in Massachusetts Bay Colony, where he talked about sinners in the hands of an angry God. That's a really, really typical understanding of this idea of covenant. It's not that we're God's chosen and God loves us and wants a relationship with us. It's some ways a very archaic understanding that we're God's chosen. You better not screw that up, because God's going to get mad. And so sinners in the hands of an angry God is really, really an important seminal work of early Protestant theology we'll talk about another week. Why am I sharing all this with you? Because I think it plays a lot out in today. When you see religious fundamentalists playing out of this sort of fear-based theology that so many of us react to and so many of us actually walk away from the faith because of, it's this same theology, isn't it? Don't offend God, because when God gets offended, everyone suffers. And so, AIDS is God's vengeance on gay people. Hurricanes are God's vengeance on cities for approving of abortionists and feminism and homosexuality and liberalism and all the things that they rail against. Even now, coronavirus, I've heard, is God's vengeance on America and on the world for accepting homosexuals because my people are so darn powerful. It's amazing what we can do. That's a different story. It's really based in this sort of cowering before an angry God. God cannot get angry, because if God gets angry, we will all suffer. And so there is raised up a whole class of religious people whose job it is to keep the rest of us in line, to make sure that God is not offended. Okay? You see this sort of playing out, this idea of chosenness, this idea of covenant. But it can also have a negative connotation. I think we see that in many ways today. Let's take it that was a little micro. Let's go macro now. What's happening in the Middle East right now between Israel and Palestine? You have to remember that in 1940, I want to say 48, do not quote me, Palestine was turned into the nation state of Israel as a result mostly of the Holocaust and previous Holocausts all throughout around the world against the Jewish people. They were given a Jewish homeland. Here's the problem. Yes, that was Israel. That was Israel until 70 AD, when the temple fell and it was no longer Israel. It had become Palestine. 1948, 47, somewhere in that area, Israel is reestablished. There were people living there all that time. That was somebody else's homeland. That was a Muslim country. And now it becomes Jewish. Here's the problem. Wherever you are on that issue, here's the problem. That is not just land. That is Israel. That is Jerusalem. If you read the story from Genesis and you read the story of Exodus, you see the Israelites wandered in the desert for 40 years. After the Egyptian exile, they wandered for 40 years and they were given a land, a promised land. That's why we call it the promised land, right? They're given a land. That land is Israel. That land is Jerusalem, the capital of Israel. That is their promised land. That is one of the prerequisite signs of what it means to be a covenant people of God. So here's the problem. Jews believe that their land is a sign of the covenant of their chosenness as a people of God. Muslims believe that their land is a sign of their covenant, their chosenness as a people of God. The problem in Israel right now, guys, is not about land. It's not about arable, farmable land. It's not about land with water. If it was about land, we could give them land. It's about that land, because of that land, that country, that particular geographic point on the earth. That land is the promise of God to God's covenanted people. And so if I, a Jew, give it to you, a Muslim, if I acquiesce and give you that land and say, okay, you can have Jerusalem, guess what? You now become God's chosen, not me. And that can't happen. If I, as a Muslim, accede the land to you, a Jew, that means that God was never with the Muslims, that Jews are God's chosen people, not Muslims. It's all about this ancient theology built on a covenant of faith as commodity. If you're chosen, I can't be, because we can't all be chosen, or chosenness has no meaning. Being in is only special if there are those who are out. Being invited to the cool kids table in high school wasn't meaningful unless it was a table where the non-cool kids sat. If everybody was cool, being cool wouldn't be cool. Does that make sense? Philosophy. Now, this is the issue with the Middle East right now. One of the big issues. It really comes down to a very intrinsic understanding, an ontological understanding of who these people are. What does it mean to be Jewish? What does it mean to be Muslim? It means you are God's chosen. The fiber of your DNA belongs to this concept of chosenness. You are God's beloved. And for anyone else to be God's beloved means you are not the covenant people. Okay, it all comes down to Berit. And this is the problem. Let me now, a couple of asides. We're going to go into Christianity, and so it's really easy for me as a Christian to point out to you that, Jews and Muslims, they fight over covenant. Aren't we glad that we don't do that in the Christian faith when we do it all the time? We do it in a different way. We don't fight over the land of Israel. We fight over the person of Jesus. Jesus becomes our sign of the covenant with God. We'll talk about that under Christianity. But what we see under Christianity is the exact same things. Baptists and Lutherans, Catholics and Episcopalians, Methodists and Presbyterians, all fighting over who follows Jesus more, who were Jesus' real disciples, who celebrates the real presence of Jesus in communion, who understands the ministry of Jesus, because Catholics say it's them, Protestants say it's them. So what we've done is just taken the sign of the covenant and made it Jesus. It's still this same faith as commodity idea, isn't it? It's still the same idea that somebody is special. And my being special is only special if you aren't special. So I need to construct a theology that affirms my specialness and delegitimizes you. And they'll know we are Christians by our love. Anyway, another sermon. This is all a part of what's at play in the next few chapters when we look at Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. This is very, very much a bedrock, foundational, seminal idea that's going to shape the theology of these groups. Now, I'm not saying we should not be monotheistic, but I will tell you, having done a lot of work in this area, I mean, it's what my doctorate's in, and having lived in other cultures and experienced other religions, you don't see Hindus killing each other over who has the right God. You don't see Buddhists killing each other over who's chosen or who's saved. These concepts are, like it or not, tied with the concept of salvation as commodity, faith as commodity. I think part of what we need to realize is that we are indeed part of the bloodiest religious tradition that's ever walked the face of the earth. And that's really horrifying. More people have died in the name of Jesus Christ than the name of any other religion to date. The Holocaust, the Inquisition, the Crusades, the Native American killings and oppression to take over our own country. So many people have died because we are Christian and we are the right religion. And if you don't believe in us, you convert or we kill you. Excuse me. That's a real problem. Is there a way, and I'll be honest, I think there is, but I'm fairly universalist. Is there a way for us to understand that there may indeed be many ways to understand the presence of the divine in my life? And I can understand what God is for me and still respect what God is for you and not demand that you believe my way or you're out. Is it possible that daddy can love all of his children the same? Does does one child have to be more special than the other? Again, super simplistic, but that's really in many ways what it comes down to. We're going to talk about this when we talk about Islam. We're going to talk about this when we talk about Christianity as well, because it does play very much into this idea that God has a chosenness. God has a chosen favorite. There is a covenant. The covenant was made with a particular people. The particular people are chosen. That chosenness means that those people live a certain way. And if we are threatened in that way, we can lose that chosenness. And by losing that chosenness, bad things happen. So in order to do that, we have to sort of keep the line, toe the line, to make sure that nothing happens from anyone that will jeopardize our covenant relationship with our God. That's what we're talking about today. Anyway, I think I've covered all of my notes for today. Enjoy your week. Have a great time. Enjoy some quiet time, perhaps during this coronavirus time. Spend some time on you. The only blessing I see in this, and I will get preachy for a minute, is we're a society that says that we are valued by what we do, what we accomplish, how much we make, how busy we are, how hectic our life is. And if there's any blessing in this week for you at all, in these next few weeks, I hope it's that you learn the power and the presence of being and not the power and presence of doing. Learn that you have value in doing absolutely nothing but sitting home, reading a book, doing a little studying, spending time with the people you love, and just being with yourself, because that really is where our value most lies. All right, guys, have a wonderful, wonderful week. Look forward to your posts on this, and we'll talk next week. Bye.